afternoon and welcome to the Central Library of Rochester and Monroe County. My name is Gabriel Pellegrino. I am the head of the Science, History, and Social Sciences Division right here in this building of the library. And we are very pleased to welcome our speaker today, Oren Kessler, who is from Rochester but has been working for many years as a journalist and political analyst in Tel Aviv, Israel. And he is here to talk about his book, which was given a special commendation by the Wall Street Journal for 2023, Palestine 1936, The Great Revolt and the Roots of the Middle East Conflict. Please welcome Oren Kessler.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. I can just use, okay. All right. Well, thank you, Gabe. Let me put my timer on here so make sure I don't go over or under. Thank you, Gabe. Thank you to everyone here at Rundell. Thank you all for coming. I know some of you have come from as far as Buffalo, which I really, really very much appreciate. I had originally thought that we were going to be doing this in the historic building across the street. So I was going to make a reference to the fact that that building is from 1936. But so what are the odds, right? What are the odds? Crazy. There's an old saying that many of you have probably heard, and it goes like this. The past is never dead. It's not even past. It's from one of Faulkner's lesser-known novels. And I think that's all the more true in the Middle East, where the past history tends to suffuse the present in a way that I think it doesn't in the West. And I think since October 7th and since the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, I think the importance of that history and that context is really greater than ever. I think so many of us want to understand how we got to this point and to have a bit more context and a bit more understanding of how we got here. So my book is my book centers on a really formative, decisive, seminal, and forgotten chapter in the history of the Holy Land, in the history of Palestine, of Zionism, of the Middle East conflict, and attempts to resolve the Middle East conflict. But I have the feeling, it's my strong feeling that this is as much an Arab story as a Jewish story, really. This is the first general account in English about this first Palestinian Arab uprising in the Holy Land. But I want to start earlier. I want to start by going over some history. There's much that's contested, there's much that's debated very heatedly, but there are also some things that are not or should not be. There are some key milestones that really help us make sense of how we got here. So I'm going to try to give you guys the roots of the Middle East conflict in about 40 minutes. So it's a lot to absorb, but bear with me here. There are many places you could start, but I think the best place to start is November 2nd, 1917. This is the date of the famous or infamous Balfour Declaration. Here is Lord Balfour, Foreign Secretary of the British Empire of Great Britain. This is in the midst of World War I, and His Majesty's government issues a declaration, the key part of which I'll read to you right now. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Unquote. Of course, those existing non-Jewish communities, we're talking about the Arabs. But notice that what's mentioned are civil and religious rights. There's nothing there about collective rights, about political rights. The Arabs of Palestine of the time and since certainly noticed that particular omission. And now historians have debated for the last century what motivated this extremely consequential declaration. And one of the most fascinating sort of treasure troves I found in my archival research were the secret testimonies from something called the Peel Commission. I'm going to get to the Peel Commission a bit later in my talk. The Peel Commission was called by the British in response to this Arab revolt. They sent a commission to Palestine to take testimony from leading Jews and Arabs and Brits and to try to figure out the causes and remedies for this revolt. And they called in dozens of witnesses and in public testimony, and they released these testimonies alongside their report. But alongside this, they had dozens of secret testimonies. And these testimonies were never meant to be released. They were meant to be destroyed. And so the people testifying, yes, sir?
I'm sorry, but would it be possible to make it a little louder?
Yeah, of course, of course. Of course. Sorry about that. I need to get a little closer here. That's better, right? All right, of course. So there were the dozens of secret testimonies that were never meant to be released. And so the witnesses, the people testifying, were extremely candid. And if not for a very far-sighted commissioner of this secretary who stowed away a few copies, these would have been lost to history. But they were declassified 80 years after the fact in 2017, very quietly, and they're extremely illuminating. And Balfour had died by this point. This is already the mid-30s, but this man came to testify about the Balfour Declaration. Does anyone know who this man is? This is David Lloyd George. He was prime minister during the Balfour Declaration's issuance. And they asked him, why did you issue this declaration? And before I read you his quote, I should say, Lloyd George, much like Balfour and some other leading British statesmen at the time, many of them were brought up with the Christian religious upbringing. Lloyd George was Baptist, Balfour was Anglican, and they had a certain spiritual religious sympathy to this idea of returning the Jews to their ancient patrimony. But they also very often, and they were quite sympathetic to the persecution of the Jews in Europe, but they also had oftentimes these ideas that if they were uttered today would be considered anti-Semitic. So I'm going to read you a quote from Lloyd George's secret testimony. He says, basically, this was World War I. This is the midst of the war. Things were very dire on all fronts. And essentially, we, the British, needed public opinion on our side in America and in Russia. And more specifically, we needed Jewish public opinion on our side. So this is what he says. We had every reason at that time to believe that in both countries, the US and Russia, the friendliness or hostility of the Jewish race might make a considerable difference. He says that the war planners believed the Jews, quote, could either hinder us or help us very materially, because they have communities all over the world and they are a dangerous people to quarrel with, but they are a very helpful people if you can get them on your side. Now, if anyone's interested in delving deeper into that, I wrote an article called A Dangerous People to Quarrel With that really dives into this very illuminating testimony. But zoom ahead, the Allies win the war, they take Palestine and the rest of the Ottoman territories, and the League of Nations is born. And this system emerges out of this newborn League of Nations of a mandate. What is a mandate? A mandate is essentially, from 2024, it looks like a quasi-colonial enterprise. But at the time, this was considered a very liberal, forward-looking, even sort of Wilsonian project. Namely, a mandate was a formerly subject territory of the Ottoman Empire, for example, that was going to be helped along the road towards self-determination, that great Wilsonian principle. And so the League of Nations mandate for Palestine is given to Britain, to the country that made this Balfour Declaration, right? This is the product of some very effective Zionist lobbying and some well-placed friends in key places. They grant the mandate to Britain, and the mandate text, the sort of constitution of the mandate, enshrines the Balfour Declaration. So right there at the top, right there in the preamble, it says, that on behalf of the League of Nations, Britain shall facilitate a Jewish national home, it being understood that nothing shall be done to infringe upon the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities, and facilitate close settlement on the land of Jews. Of course, the Arabs of the time, then and now, say, hey, we were never consulted on this matter. This was a matter that was figured out by the leading Western European powers of the day. The U.S. didn't join the League of Nations, but it gave its support from the sidelines, with a few non-European nations, but essentially this was a European project alongside, done in conjunction with the Jews. We were never consulted. Nonetheless, the mandate begins, and Britain, just to show how committed it was to this Zionist enterprise, this Zionist experiment, sends this man to the Holy Land to be the first High Commissioner for Palestine, this man on the left. Some of you may recognize the man on the right. That's Winston Churchill. This is the early 20s when he was colonial secretary. This photo's from Jerusalem. The man on the left is Herbert Samuel, and he was the first Jew in the British cabinet. He was an early Zionist, and Lloyd George sends him to Palestine to be the first High Commissioner on Britain's behalf. And one of the first things that this Herbert Samuel does in Jerusalem is he nominates, or appoints rather, this man. Does anyone recognize this man? David Cohen, I see you nodding your head. It's the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. A+, exactly. This is Haji Amin al-Husseini, the famous, infamous, notorious Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who in World War II would gain infamy for spending the war at the side of Hitler and Himmler in Berlin. But in this very early stage, in the early 1920s, he manages to convince Herbert Samuel that he's a moderate, that he's willing to work with the British and with the Jews. And Samuel, on behalf of the British Empire, invests him with this tremendous power of being Grand Mufti and head of the Supreme Muslim Council. This is basically a position for life that makes him the most powerful Arab and Muslim in Palestine. So, as tends to happen in that part of the world where I was living until September, maybe I still live there, I'm not really sure, violence breaks out in 1920, in 1921, in 1929, quite gruesomely. But all of these outbursts of violence, I argue, they lasted a few days, typically. They were outbursts of riots, of terrorism, of violence, but they did not represent a sustained, concerted nationalist uprising. They did not represent an intifada, as we might call it today. The first time we see anything like that is, you could probably guess, at this point is 1936. And so that brings me to sort of the core of my book, namely the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39. It's a 3-year uprising on the eve of World War II. Now, you can't really understand this period without looking at the demographic backdrop, specifically Jewish immigration. As we know, Hitler comes to power in January 1933 in Germany. He's elected, actually. Elsewhere in Europe, you have anti-Semitic movements on the rise in Hungary and Poland and Romania. And this has the effect of just turbocharging Jewish immigration to the Holy Land. Can everyone hear me? Am I coming in more clear? Great. And so in the first half of the 1930s, the Jewish population of Palestine doubles. The population of Tel Aviv triples. It's worth recalling that here in this country, since the 1924 Immigration Act, the doors of this country were virtually closed to immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. And so really Palestine was virtually the only sanctuary left for the persecuted Jews of Europe who were increasingly desperate to leave. Some of them were infused with Zionist enthusiasm, but many of them probably would have come to these shores if they could have. Land sales double in this period, Jewish land purchases from Arabs. And it becomes very clear to the Arabs of Palestine, and terminology, like everything in this conflict, can be a minefield, but I try to use the terminology of the time. And so, at the time, people would talk, whether Jewish, Arab, British, would talk about the Arabs of Palestine, the Jews of Palestine, Palestinian Arabs, Palestinian Jews, believe it or not, as paradoxical as that sounds today. And so it was very clear to the Arabs of the land, and not just the elites in the cities, but even subsistence farmers in the countryside, it was clear that the face of the land was changing. And if things went on this way, the Jews would be a majority before long. In 1935, 60,000 Jews come to the country. That's double the figure of just a couple years before. And so there's a man whose name will be known to some of you who follow the news. It's this man in the middle here. It's Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. Those of you who read the news regularly will know Qassam has lent his name to Hamas's armed wing. It's a terrorist wing that committed the atrocities of October 7th. That's Qassam in the middle. This is Palestine newspaper from 1936, came out in Jaffa. And Qassam was a preacher, a Muslim preacher, an imam. He was a jihadi preacher. He was originally from Syria. He became wanted by the French mandate authorities up there, and he fled down to Palestine, to Haifa in the early 1920s. And he's preaching at a mosque in Haifa. The mosque still exists. You can visit it in Haifa. Still an active mosque. And he's preaching jihad. He often preaches with a gun or a sword at his side. He wants, and he's preaching to the urban Muslim proletariat of Haifa, which is really a boom town in this period. And he's preaching things like, at a certain point, a shoe shiner comes and sits in his mosque, and he urges the shoe shiner to exchange his brush for a pistol and shoot the next Englishman who sits down on the stool, that sort of thing. And so he, along with some of his followers, start waging a few sporadic attacks against British targets and Jewish targets. Some of these are even deadly. And at a certain point, they kill a Jewish member of the Palestine police. And this was a major mistake, because now they've killed a servant of His Majesty's police. Long story short, a manhunt ensues, and the British kill this Sheikh Qassam near Jenin, in what we now call the West Bank, which is still very much a center of Palestinian militancy today. And he really when he's killed, he's on all the front pages, all the Arabic front pages, and he really becomes the first Palestinian martyr icon. I'm going to drop one more name here who will be known to many of you. It's David Ben-Gurion, who will eventually be Israel's first prime minister. Even in this early period, he's sort of the clear leader of the Jews of Palestine, the land of Israel, the Holy Land. And Ben-Gurion writes in his diary, he recognizes the significance of this moment immediately. He writes, "Finally, the Arabs have found a man who's willing to die for an ideal, or for an idea." And he predicted that hundreds or even thousands more would follow in his wake. And indeed, that's exactly what happens. Qassam is killed in December 1935, and a few months after that, in April 1936, some of his followers ambush a Jewish car driving between Nablus and Jenin, again, still a center of Palestinian militancy today. They kill 3 Jews, and these are really the opening shots of the great Arab revolt. And so the revolt begins in just spontaneous acts of violence, but very soon it's matched by economic and political action and demands. So Arab leaders, Arab notables announce a strike. They announce a complete general strike, a boycott of the British authorities, the British economy, the Jewish economy. There's some resonance there today with the whole boycott Israel movement, I think. They announced this boycott, and then they cut all contact with the British and with the Jews, and then the Mufti rushes to assert his political leadership over this revolt. And he says, this revolt and this strike will continue until our demands are met. Chief among them, a complete stop on Jewish immigration, a complete ban on Jewish immigration, and a complete ban on land sales, because very many prominent, wealthy Arab landowners were selling land quite happily at inflated prices to the Jews, even as they railed against the practice in public. Side note, the Mufti never sold any land, as far as I could tell, so you could say a lot about the Mufti, but he was consistent. He wasn't hypocritical. And this is really a source of tremendous pride for the Arabs of Palestine. This strike ends up lasting 6 months. This is, even to this day, one of the longest general strikes anywhere in history. And really, this revolt, this strike, this unified action becomes really a crucible of Palestinian Arab identity. This is the Mufti's finest hour. This is when virtually all of mandate of Arab Palestine lines up, at least ostensibly, behind his leadership. So rival families, rich and poor, Muslim and Christian to a large extent, urban and rural, all line up in this single effort against a common foe, namely Zionism and its British imperial facilitator, midwife, if you like. And so this is really the first kind of key legacy that I want to highlight to you this afternoon, is the formative effect that this has on Palestinian Arab nationalism. And, another sidebar here, I really wanted this book to be a book about people. It may sound like a bit of a cliche, but I really wanted to choose a few sort of hand-picked characters from all three sides, namely Arab, Jewish, and British, and to sort of reveal great historical events and movements through individual people. So don't look, because I'm going to zoom through okay. Gabe, did I mess everything up? I wanted to show the very last slide. Here we go. This man here, should I just do, how's that? This is a man named Musa Alami, and Musa Alami was from a very very prestigious, very ancient Jerusalem Arab family, and he's, I think, of my quote-unquote Arab characters in this book, I think readers have connected to him more than anyone. He's kind of a forgotten figure, and I really thought he was ripe for plucking from semi-obscurity. Musa Alami was an Arab nationalist in every way, but he was a Cambridge man. He was very brilliant by all accounts. He was probably the first Palestinian Arab to attend Cambridge. But despite being an Arab nationalist, he had many friends among the British, and indeed many friends among the Jews. And he was very widely hailed as a moderate by all three sides, and a real sort of a real humanist. And one of the kind of subplots or through lines of my book is a series of meetings that Alami has with his friend, David Ben-Gurion. And he and Ben-Gurion meet a number of times throughout the 1930s and really try to hammer out some kind of modus vivendi, some kind of coexistence, or some kind of deal, agreement that would be acceptable to the Arabs and to the Jews. And spoiler alert, it doesn't work out. I won't tell you why, because then you won't read the book. But I did want to highlight the fact that this is not only a period of death and destruction and conflict. There were attempts, quite serious attempts, at coexistence. So let me go back here and try not to screw up all my tech here. All right, there's Qassam. So essentially this revolt flares up, this strike begins, the Mufti makes his political demands, they hold out for 6 months, and these efforts really bear fruit because the British send a royal commission. This is the Peel Commission that I mentioned earlier. They send a royal commission, namely, this is the highest form of commission of inquiry that the British Empire has. This is a commission sent by the king himself. In this case, this is the very short-lived Edward VIII, who famously would abdicate within about half an hour to marry an American divorcee, famously. But in his half hour on the throne, he manages to dispatch this commission to Palestine, and here they are. This man in the mustache is Lord Peel, hence the Peel Commission. Some of his fellow commissioners on his flanks, that's Emir Abdullah of Transjordan, who was appointed by the British. He's the grandfather of the current king. And so the commission comes to the country. It spends several months in the country, in the land. They meet with British administrators, British generals, British army men, leading Zionists, eventually leading Arabs once the Mufti calls off his boycott. That's Chaim Weizmann, he's head of the World Zionist Organization, coming in to testify. And they produce a 400-page report. And if anyone has the next 4 to 6 weeks free, I strongly suggest they read it, because it's a very good report. I've read all of the commissions of inquiry from the mandate, and it's by far the best one. But it's remembered by history really for its last 12 or 14 pages, in which they propose a radical solution to this nascent Jewish-Arab conflict, namely partition, division. I don't know if you guys can see that map closely, but they propose a two-state solution, if you like, for the very first time. and one that includes a Jewish state. This is a revolutionary notion. This is not a Jewish national home, as promised by the Balfour Declaration, but a state with everything that means. That presumably means borders, that means an army, presumably, that means control over immigration. And so this red section is the state that they propose for the Jews. So it's roughly from a little bit south of Tel Aviv all the way up the coast to Lebanon, and then including the entire Galilee, which was a real prize to the Jews because it was overwhelmingly Arab in this period. And then the rest would be the Arab state, and the kind of, that little section with the little hash marks would be a sort of rump mandate in which the British would remain around the holiest land, around Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And so this is really the second legacy that I want to highlight today, is this, the birth of the two-state solution. This becomes the template, at least the ideological template, for every subsequent plan of partition of a two-state solution until our present day. And there's a raucous debate among the Jewish Zionist leadership about whether to accept it or not. You know, many people are quite upset that it's only a part of the historic land of Israel. But the two men who matter most are Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, heads of the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization, respectively. And they play coy. They sort of don't, you know, maybe yes, maybe no. But I've read their memoirs, I've read their correspondence. They were both ecstatic about this idea. They didn't think it would be the last word territorially, but they saw it as a foothold for, particularly for the persecuted Jews of Europe, who they were very desperate to bring over. And Weizmann says, you know, we'd be crazy not to accept it, even if it were the size of a tablecloth. And so they accept this plan with all kinds of reservations. Meanwhile, as you could probably imagine, the man who matters most on the Arab side is the Mufti himself, and he rejects it out of hand. He says it's an amputation and a degradation and a humiliation, and he says there's no way they'll accept it. So the commissioners go back to England, and a few months later, violence breaks out again, much more fiercely than before, and now the Mufti is a wanted man, because it's clear to everyone, it's clear to Arabs and Jews and Brits, that he's ultimately pulling the strings of this revolt. That doesn't mean he's sending out every gunman to kill people. I should mention about 80-some Jews and several dozen British servicemen have been killed at this point. By the end of the revolt, 500 Jews will be dead, and about half that many British servicemen. So these are really significant numbers. These are numbers we wouldn't see until the 21st century. But the Mufti is a wanted man. He flees the country under the cover of night, dressed either as a Bedouin or as a woman, depending on which source you rely upon. And he flees, he sets up shop in Beirut, and he won't be back to the Holy Land for 4 decades. But even from his exile, he's still pulling the strings of this uprising. Now, the British have a problem because they are faced with this very fierce uprising, insurgency, rebellion, revolt, choose your word, and they simply don't have the troop numbers to do very much about it. This is already 1937, 1938, and the war clouds are gathering over Europe. It seems to be a question of when and not if war with Hitler is going to erupt. And so what do? And this gets us to our third major takeaway and legacy of this revolt that I want to talk about today. The British agreed to a long-standing Jewish plea to arm and train them in large numbers. And again, apologies if you can't make out faces here, but the man who's pointing is a man by the name of Moshe Dayan, who many of you perhaps have seen. This is one of the very few photos of Moshe Dayan pre-eye patch. One of the only ones I could find. And these are members of the Jewish supernumerary police. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but the British, faced with this insurgency, this revolt, they arm and train and often pay the salaries of 15,000 to 20,000 Jews who they integrate into the Palestine police. And so again, they're getting their weapons and their money and their training from the British, who are still the preeminent military power in the world. But it's abundantly clear to everyone that they ultimately answer to the Haganah. The Haganah are the mainstream Jewish Zionist armed group at this time, which is still technically illegal, but the British tolerate it as long as it kind of behaves itself and limits itself to self-defense. And so the British really sow the seed of a Jewish army. And as you can imagine, this is a tremendously consequential thing that they do. They sow the seed for a Jewish, a Zionist army. This is also the era of a man by the name of Ord Wingate. This is Ord Wingate. He was an officer, a British army officer posted to Palestine. He was an extremely devout Christian. We would probably call him an evangelical today. He was, and because of that strong Christian faith, that led him to be a very strong Zionist, which was very unusual among his peers in the British Army and the British administration, who were rather more skeptical of this whole Zionist experiment. He was a very eccentric man. He had a habit of welcoming guests in the nude. He had a habit of eating onions like apples, oftentimes in the nude. But he was, perhaps more important than all of these, he was a military genius, by all accounts. And he created something called the Special Night Squads, which were mixed British-Jewish units that operated at night and took the fight to the enemy. And in doing so, he really created sort of the first Jewish special forces and really the core, the seed of a future officer corps, Jewish officer corps. And men like Moshe Dayan and Yigal Allon, who would go on to lead the Israeli army and the Israeli defense establishment, got their start in Wingate's squads. So we're already in sort of mid-1938, and this is really the peak of the Arab revolt, okay? So you see here the numbers that they were able to muster. You see some village reinforcements in the back. And this is really, this is a period in which the Arab rebels take over a number of cities in Palestine. These are kids in Bethlehem who are clearly very excited that the rebels have taken over the city, and the British are not controlling the city, the Arab rebels are. This is the peak of the revolt, and it's really only when the Munich crisis comes and goes, namely, this is the Chamberlain government already. This is the era of appeasement. When Chamberlain flies to Germany and appeases Hitler, and the world sort of breathes a sigh of relief that war has been averted, at least for now, it's only then that the British are able to send large numbers of troops to Palestine. That's what they do. They send 2 divisions. This is the biggest, British military deployment between the world wars. And they begin a very heavy-handed counterinsurgency, or campaign of repressing this revolt. Some would even say they waged a brutal campaign. This is the period when home demolitions begin on a large scale. This is a period in which collective punishment is really just part of the game. It was actually legal by British standards to engage in collective punishment. So if a bomb was laid on a highway, for example, against a British convoy, British troops would show up and they would take out the village headman, the Mukhtar, and they would say, okay, who did it? And if you couldn't tell them, they would start blowing up houses. At least 100 Arabs were hanged in this period, but thousands were killed by British forces in gun battles. This is the period when administrative detention begins, namely the Brits allowed themselves to detain people without any specific charges as part of these emergency regulations. And really a lot of the most controversial methods that the IDF employs today have their roots, both in terms of the methods used and even the legal basis thereof in this period, because Israel inherited so many British laws when it arose, and the IDF is modeled on the British Army in so many ways. And so through this very heavy-handed insurgency, the revolt is kind of put on the ropes. But it's helped along quite significantly by just a convulsion of Arab infighting. And that initial unity that I talked about in the first phase of the revolt, where everyone lined up behind the Mufti in this common effort, that unity dissolves or explodes. And you see scores settling between rival families under the cover of this, the pretext of this ostensibly nationalist rebellion. You just see the social fabric really torn as people settle scores under this pretext. And so I should also mention the following. This is also a period in which really you see Jewish terrorism for the first time on the landscape in any significant way. I don't think there's any other way to put it. You have the Haganah, which is kind of the mainstream Jewish armed group, which for the most part clings to this policy of self-restraint. They want to show the British that they could be trusted with weapons, and that's exactly what happens. But then you have a dissident group called the Irgun, the National Military Organization, whose ideological leader is a guy named Vladimir Jabotinsky. And they have a very different approach. Their approach is one much closer to an eye for an eye. And they believe that if they need to show that Jewish blood will not be shed in vain. They believe that there needs to be a price for attacks on Jews. And so they start engaging, they start leaving bombs in the Arab vegetable market in Haifa with the express goal of killing civilians. The idea was not simply to kill, but to deter. They had this idea that if they show that they were engaged, that for every Jew killed, an Arab would be killed, that this would deter attacks on Jews. And so really through these British countermeasures, this very heavy-handed British response and this Arab infighting, and indeed a certain amount of Jewish terrorism, the revolt is really on the ropes. But the British were determined to quell it completely. This is, as I mentioned, the era of appeasement. And the appeasement was not a word just used by people like Winston Churchill, who opposed it. This was essentially government policy by the Chamberlain administration. And not just vis-a-vis Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, but even vis-a-vis the Arab and Muslim worlds. And you can see, in the cabinet discussions that they use words like appeasement. They use words about, quote unquote, appeasing Arab and Muslim sentiment ahead of an expected world war with Hitler. They were particularly worried, the British, about the large Muslim population of India. This is pre-partition India. This includes the lands we now call Pakistan and Bangladesh with their very large Muslim populations. And they were worried that if the Muslims of the empire were angry over Palestine, that they wouldn't be on board with the world war, with the Allied war effort. And so the British, with their endless lust for commissions and committees and conferences, they call a conference at St. James's Palace in London. They invite leading Jews, they invite leading Palestinian Arabs, and indeed Arab leaders from around the region. They invite them to the palace for something called the St. James's Conference, but the conclusion of this conference is already foregone. It's already clear what's going to happen. The point of calling this conference is to roll back this Zionist experiment, which the British have determined is just too costly for them. And so this man is a man named Malcolm MacDonald. He was colonial secretary. He was the son of the first Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald. He's only about 36, 37 in this period, so he's younger than me. And he convenes this conference, and he basically, at the end of this conference, they announced something called the White Paper. This is the famous or infamous White Paper of 1939, which significantly rolls back the whole Zionist project. So I mentioned earlier that 60,000 Jews came to Palestine in 1935. So the White Paper says over the next 5 years, 75,000 Jews can enter the country, total, over those 5 years, after which any further immigration would be contingent on Arab consent. And of course, it was evident that that consent would not be forthcoming. And so, of course, the Jews are furious. They view this as a betrayal, as a reneging on not just the Peel Commission's proposal of a two-state solution, but on the Balfour Declaration itself. These are huge protests in Jerusalem. And that's outside the Jewish Agency building. You can see in the middle the flag that would become the Israeli flag. And this is May 1939, so this is really a crucial, critical period for the persecuted Jews of Europe, of course. And this is really probably the fourth and final legacy that I want to highlight today, is that essentially the last significant sort of refuge for the Jews of Europe is closed just before, or mostly closed, just before the outbreak of the Second World War. And so, my time is ticking away here, and so I think I'm going to start to wrap up and just sum up the kind of the effects and the legacy of this revolt for all sides. These are some folks in Tel Aviv, some Jews who are very angry about the white paper, and you see the British police chasing them as the people watch on the rooftop. I just think it's kind of a cool photo. And so, this was obviously a very painful period for the Jewish community. They lost 500 people. Many more were wounded. It was very painful indeed, but the sort of Zionist leadership embodied by Ben-Gurion were really experts at turning adversity into advantage. And Ben-Gurion saw in the Arab revolt a tremendous source of leverage to reach his long-standing goal of basically creating a self-sufficient sort of Jewish proto-state that could defend itself and house itself, employ itself, feed itself without any help from the Arabs or from the Brits. This is not a single settlement is abandoned throughout this Arab revolt, but dozens more spring up around the country in strategic places. I talked earlier about the military gains that the Jews made. Economically, they grow by leaps and bounds as well. So in all of these ways, the sort of Jewish Zionist community, if you like, really the core of their future state, the kind of springboard that they would use to establish their state a decade on is really established, is really cohesive at this point in 1939 when the Arab revolt fizzles out and when the World War begins and everything is sort of put on hold in Palestine. And then when you look at the Arab side of the equation, it's really the mirror image. The revolt to crush Zionism ends up crushing the Arabs themselves. I mentioned earlier just the tremendous infighting and score settling that we see as in the second phase of the revolt. You've got just a tremendous amount of bad blood within Arab society. You've got thousands of men killed by the British and probably even more by their fellow Arabs. And you've got the huge numbers of weapons are confiscated. The economy is just completely devastated. You've got the elites fleeing the country. This is another precursor to 1948. The probably tens of thousands of Arab elites flee the country. And so in all of these ways, the Arab society is just completely gutted and devastated. And so really one of the sort of central takeaways, perhaps the central takeaway of my book is that when you see the final reckoning, the final showdown between Arabs and Jews in the Holy Land in 1947-48, really one side has already won that battle and one side has already lost it nearly 10 years in advance. And so I'll just leave you guys with the thought that I try to make in this book, which is that for both Israelis and Palestinians and Israelis, this revolt very much rages on. So I think I'll end there, and thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Just background for my own knowledge, way back, let's say before World War I, I'm assuming there were a few Jews in Palestine.
Yeah.
The Jews that were there, was there a resentment against them at that time?
Very, very good question. Everyone heard the question? Essentially, before the Balfour Declaration, before the British Mandate, the Jewish population of Palestine was probably about 7%, something like that, mostly concentrated in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a majority Jewish city, even from the late 19th century. But these were mostly religious Jews, mostly non-Zionist. And so, they were, I think there are a lot of things that are very complex about this conflict, but certain things are quite simple. And I think demographics have always been a somewhat simple equation. Namely, when the Jews were 7% or 10% or 15%, things were relatively stable. But there was always a question of who's going to be the majority. And mainstream Zionism always had the goal of becoming the majority. And I think in many ways it's always been a question of who's got that 51%. And so I guess to try to answer your question, I think when the Jews were in relatively small numbers, intercommunal relations were relatively good, with the exceptions I mentioned earlier. There were outbursts of violence, but they were relatively okay. But as those numbers rose and rose, and there was a threat really of Jewish majority, that's when things got really, really bad. That's when this revolt broke out. Yeah. Yes.
You kept saying, the bad blood and the conflict of the Arabs against each other. What was the main conflict? Was it territory? Was it who's running the decision-making? And also, the peripheral Arab countries around Palestine, where were they on this?
Great questions. Both were great questions. History rarely hinges on the shoulders of one man or woman, so I'm hesitant to blame everything on the Mufti. There were a lot of things going on beyond the Mufti, but the Mufti was able, from his exile, the Mufti was able to exert his control on the country. And so a lot of this score settling, not all of it, was conducted by the Mufti and his allies, who, if they perceived someone within Palestine to be an enemy, whether that person was or not, they often ended up in quite a bit of trouble. Sometimes they ended up dead. And so, if anyone who was perceived to be deviating from the Mufti's line tended to find himself in trouble. And then I think a lot of just older fissures within society, there's nothing like a war or a threat to bring a society together, right? There's this rally around the flag dynamic which we see all over the world. And so I think when the revolt first began, there was a period of unity in which old divisions, because there's divisions in every society, right? There's divisions between the rich and poor. There's divisions between the cities and the country, religious divisions and family divisions. Those divisions were kind of papered over or ignored for the sake of the greater cause for a good 6 months to a year. And then those divisions just kind of reemerged with a vengeance, yeah. The second question was about the neighboring Arab states. A very good question. Man, I'm obsessively talking about the Mufti here, but I have to. It was one of his key strategic goals was to make Palestine a concern of the entire Arab world and indeed the entire Muslim world. And he was very successful in that. So, for example, in 1928-29, he launched this whole campaign to raise awareness about what he perceived as the threat to Al-Aqsa, right? He had this idea that the Jews were going to try to destroy Al-Aqsa and rebuild the temple. And so in the early 30s, he called something called the Jerusalem Conference, and he invited Muslims from as far as Pakistan and Afghanistan to Jerusalem to really make Palestine and Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa specifically a central Arab and Muslim concern. And he was extremely successful in doing that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Looking at 1939, I'm trying to figure out, there was a period of time that Hitler allowed the Jews to leave Germany and its held territories.
Yeah.
And then he stopped that, so they were not allowed to leave. So I'm looking at 1939 with the commission that suddenly stopped the immigration of Jews to Israel.
Right.
And I'm wondering the juxtaposition there.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And this is one thing I do try to do quite a bit in the book, is bounce back between Palestine and Europe, because Palestine and the world, but particularly Europe, because the developments in Palestine can't really be understood without looking at the developments in Europe. They're intertwined, and so it would, from Hitler's perspective, there was a period in the early and mid-30s that he had this idea that he would just try to push all the Jews out, and there was actually quite a controversial agreement between Nazi Germany and the Zionist leadership for a few years there to allow Jews to leave Germany and bring most of their property to Palestine. But at a certain point, Hitler determined that that wasn't good enough, quote unquote, that not enough of them, that it was that not enough of them were leaving, that they would just continue their whatever Hitler believed in Palestine, and he, at some point in the mid to late 30s, probably lit upon this idea of mass murder. Yeah, so it's when the white paper goes into effect in mid-1939, and then when the World War begins, that the World War begins, that really, Jews can't leave Germany, and really they can't leave Europe for the most part. The number of Jews who come from Europe to Palestine during the war is very small. It's very hard to leave Europe, obviously. And the white paper remains in effect. The white paper remains in effect basically until the British leave Palestine in 1947. And this is often forgotten, I think, but the Arab revolt that is the core of my book was followed after the World War with the Jewish revolt, right? There was just like there was a 3-year Arab revolt against the British Empire, there was a 3-year Jewish revolt starting about 1944 really against the white paper, against this idea that Jews, even those who survived Hitler, could not come to Palestine except in small numbers. And so, and it was then that the British said, okay, we're out. They handed the problem over to the United Nations in 1947, and then, as we know, basically the UN votes to partition the land, again, using as a template the Peel plan of exactly 10 years before. And the first Jewish-Arab war begins in earnest the day after that UN partition resolution. Yeah.
I think I may have missed something.
Yeah, I know it's a lot of information. I know it's a lot.
44 to 47.
Yeah.
Why was there Jewish restriction?
So essentially, this white paper of 1939 remained in force. It was never rolled back. So the British had enough headaches in Palestine, and once Churchill replaced Chamberlain, Churchill was quite a Zionist, quite a firm Zionist, really throughout his political career. Churchill basically told the Jews, eventually I'll get around to rolling back this white paper, but the British government never did, and the Jews were very furious about that, especially after the war and after the Holocaust. You had all these people in DP camps. The white paper remained in force, and so that was really the backdrop for the Jewish revolt. There's a very good book called Anonymous Soldiers by a guy named Bruce Hoffman, which is about this, again, very often forgotten Jewish revolt against the British, without which probably there wouldn't be a state of Israel today.
Why did the British limit immigration back in 1939?
Well, because of the Arab revolt, essentially. This is really the undeniable success of the Arab revolt, is that it prompted this white paper, which significantly limited Jewish immigration. So, so despite all of the devastation suffered by the Arabs, they achieved that goal, which was core. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I've got 2 questions. I'm not sure I'll explain them properly, but first of all, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more, if you would, about the is it the Mufti?
Yeah. Is there anything more to say? I feel like I've been talking about it for an hour.
Yeah. I just wondered how important. I mean, the Arabs were concerned, obviously, about what was going on, but he managed to, even from afar.
Yeah.
Was he a charismatic person? Was he? How important was his personality or whatever to enable him to pull everybody together? And the other one was maybe just a quick one. Do you see any hope at all from anything that's happened in the past 2 or 3 years?
These are great questions. The Mufti was, interestingly, he never learned English, which is pretty fascinating, because he lived and worked with and under the British for 18 years. But he was, by most accounts, he had a certain quiet charisma. He was very well spoken. He was very, what's the word? He was very gracious in the way he spoke. they say he had a very poetic, eloquent, quiet way of speaking, which I think charmed a lot of people. Yeah, and so I think that really, that charisma really counted for a lot, but also, as I mentioned earlier, the British gave him a position. They basically, all of the sort of religious authorities that the Ottoman Empire used to run were basically transferred over to the Mufti, right? And again, it was essentially a position for life. So they gave him tremendous power. And one of the, I think, there are a lot of what ifs in my book. What if this hadn't happened? What if, right? And there are many points at which things could have gone differently. And one of the huge what ifs is, what if someone else had been chosen to be Mufti? What if the main division within Palestinian Arab society in this period is between the Husseinis and their camp, namely the Mufti and their allies, and the Nashashibis. And the Nashashibis were generally considered more moderate, more willing. They were not, they were not Zionists by any stretch, but they were more willing to work with the British, to work with the Jews. And for example, the partition plan was accepted by the Nashashibis. And quite a few of their allied mayors who were mayors of major cities, Nablus and Jaffa and Haifa, I believe, accepted this partition plan privately, but they told the British that they accepted it. For example, they accepted the white paper. The white paper was a huge victory for the Arabs. There were celebrations in the streets of Nablus and Nazareth, but the Mufti rejected the white paper because it didn't go far enough. So, there are these huge what ifs. What if someone else had been named the Grand Mufti? What if that first two-state solution had gone through back in 1937? Maybe there wouldn't have been a war in 1948. Maybe there wouldn't be a 7-decade-long Palestinian refugee problem. Maybe the Gaza Strip wouldn't be teeming with refugees in 2024, right? Maybe no one would have had to leave their homes. The mind can wander about all that could have been. And then, of course, what if the white paper had not been passed? Perhaps large numbers of Jews could be saved from Hitler. It's really the imagination can run wild. And so I hope that answers your first question. And on the second question, so I just mentioned a moment ago that there were so many moments in this story with so many crossroads at which things could have gone differently, and it's hard to be optimistic, certainly in this day and age with what's happening in the Middle East. It's hard to be optimistic after writing this book because there is so much death and destruction and conflict. But the idea that things could have gone differently at so many points in the past suggests that just maybe they still can in the future. There's a lot of very grim news coming out of that part of the world, of course. I'm sure you all read the papers. Or does anyone read the papers? I'm sure you all read online. And but it's not all bad. It's not all bad. I've been reading that there are ongoing negotiations to free the hostages and in exchange have a ceasefire, at least a temporary one. I think anyone would have to get on board. Well, I think I certainly would like to see that happen. There's the Abraham Accords. I think were a real sea change in relations in the region. I think it was a very big deal, to use a technical term. Israel and Saudi Arabia are talking about normalization. So, look, it's hard to be optimistic about the Israeli-Palestinian arena itself. It's so many times it's been tried to split that knot, and every time it fails. But I think if you zoom out a bit, it's not all terrible. That's as optimistic as I can be. There are points of light, both for this war that we find ourselves in now, this awful war, and indeed at a more macro level. All right, I found a way to end on a positive note. Yes, that's not easy.
Okay, well, we want to thank you very much, Oren, for being with us. Oren will be in the back signing copies of his book, or selling copies of his book for whoever is interested. Also, I'd like to let you know, next week we have on Monday, the Lyndon B. Johnson and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, hosted by Mark Sample, who has done many of our history programs. And then Tuesday, February 27th, This is a Zoom program, part of In Conversation with ROC's Black Leaders, Melanie Funchess. This is a Zoom program co-hosted by the local history division and the science and history division. I have a little sign-up sheet over on the table there in case you're interested in getting emails about our programs and some flyers regarding other things going on in the library. Thank you all for being here.